snow drove sideways like broken glass, swallowing the horizon. That scrap metal dome will be your coffin. Robert had scoffed just 3 days prior. Now, trapped inside with hurricane-force winds screaming outside, 60-year-old Roland Pendleton tightened his grip on his radio. His neighbor was dead wrong, but survival wasn't guaranteed. Roland Pendleton did not move to the isolated ridges of the Wind River Range in Wyoming to make friends. After 40 years as a structural engineer in Chicago, navigating building codes and corporate bureaucracy, all he wanted was silence. He bought 40 acres of rugged, unforgiving alpine terrain and set about building his retirement home. But Roland didn't build a picturesque log cabin like the rest of the wealthy transplants in the valley. He built what the locals derisively dubbed the Iron Turtle. It was a semi-subterranean, geodesic structure. The foundation was dug deep into the bedrock, and the walls were constructed using rammed earth tires encased in reinforced concrete. The roof was a sloping, aerodynamic dome made of interconnected triangular steel plates, layered with industrial-grade polycarbonate and covered in 2 feet of topsoil and native grasses. From a distance, it looked like a bunker. Up close, it looked like an architectural mistake. His closest neighbor, a retired real estate developer named Robert Sterling, was particularly vocal about his disdain. Robert had built a multi-million-dollar, 3-story A-frame cabin a mile up the ridge, boasting panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows and imported Norwegian timber. "You're ruining the property value, Artie," Robert had said one crisp November afternoon, leaning against the hood of his pristine Range Rover. "It looks like a post-apocalyptic storm drain. When the winter snowpack hits, that flat-topped dome of yours is going to cave in like a wet cardboard box. You can't fight the mountain with scrap metal." Roland had simply adjusted his worn canvas jacket, looking at Robert's towering A-frame. "Snow doesn't just sit, Robert. It drifts. It blows. You build against the wind, not just the weight." Robert had laughed, a booming, condescending sound that echoed off the pines. "Well, when your roof comes down, don't expect me to dig you out." 3 months later, the sky turned a bruised, sickly purple. Meteorologists called it a generational anomaly, a massive atmospheric river from the Pacific colliding with an Arctic polar vortex directly over the Rockies. The National Weather Service didn't just issue a blizzard warning, they issued a civil emergency. They predicted snowfall rates of 5 inches per hour, accompanied by sustained winds of 80 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 120. By the time the warning reached the valley, evacuation routes were already impassable. Whiteout conditions had descended in a matter of hours. The temperature plummeted to 35 degrees below zero. Inside the Iron Turtle, Roland was calm. His home was designed exactly for this. The aerodynamic slope of his roof meant that the hurricane-force winds simply swept over the structure, carrying the snow with it rather than allowing it to pile up. The earth-bermed walls provided massive thermal mass, trapping the heat from his central cast-iron wood stove, while the storm raged outside, sounding like a continuous freight train bearing down on him. Roland sat in his armchair, sipping black coffee, listening to the crackle of his ham radio. Emergency channels were chaotic. Dispatcher Sarah Jenkins, operating out of the county seat 30 miles away, was calmly trying to manage a nightmare. Power lines were snapping like dry twigs. Trees were being uprooted. Then, at 2:14 a.m. on the second night of the storm, a different voice cut through the static on the local community band. "Mayday. Anyone? "This is Robert Sterling. Is anyone out there?" Roland sat up, spilling his coffee. He grabbed the mic. "Robert, this is Roland. I read you. What's your situation?" The voice on the other end was trembling, stripped of all its usual arrogance. "Roland, oh, thank God. It's the house. The wind. It blew out the west-facing windows 3 hours ago. The temperature inside is sub-zero. And the roof." A loud groan transmitted through the radio, followed by a sharp crack. "The roof is bowing. The structural beams are splitting. I think it's going to collapse." Roland's heart pounded. Robert's A-frame was designed to shed snow, but its towering height made it a massive sail against the 120-mile-per-hour winds. And with the wind pushing snow against the broken windows, the house was being ripped apart from the inside out. "Robert, listen to me," Roland commanded. "You have to get out. If that timber snaps, it will crush you." "I can't," Robert screamed over the radio. "I can't see past my own hand outside. The snow is up to my chest. I'll freeze to death in 10 minutes. Roland looked around his impenetrable bunker. He was safe. He was warm. Stepping outside meant risking his own life for a man who had done nothing but mock him. But Roland was an engineer. He understood the physics of what was happening to Robert's house. It wasn't a possibility of collapse. It was an impending certainty. "Put on every layer you have," Roland said, his voice hard. "Get your snowshoes. I am coming to get you. You can't make it up the ridge." "I'm not walking up the ridge. Robert, I'm following the tree line. Tie yourself to the heaviest piece of furniture near the door and wait for me. And wait." Roland geared up. Thermal base layers, a heavy wool sweater, an insulated parka, ski goggles, and a climbing harness. He attached a heavy-duty carabiner to a spool of high-tensile climbing rope he kept anchored to a steel ring inside his airlock entrance. Stepping out of the Iron Turtle was like stepping onto another planet. The cold was a physical blow, instantly freezing the moisture in his nose. The wind roared with a deafening, mechanical shriek. He couldn't see the trees 20 feet away. He dropped to his hands and knees, letting the aerodynamic curve of his roof guide him to the tree line. The journey took an hour and a half. It was a brutal crawl through waist-deep, shifting snowdrifts, navigating by memory and the slight incline of the terrain. When he finally bumped into the stone pillars of Robert's driveway, he almost collapsed. The A-frame was a terrifying sight. The wind was violently shaking the structure. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows were gone, replaced by a gaping maw swallowing the blizzard. Roland forced his way inside the shattered door. "Robert!" he roared. A huddled mass emerged from behind a snow-covered kitchen island. Robert was pale, shivering uncontrollably, his lips a terrifying shade of blue. Roland didn't waste time with words. He clipped a secondary carabiner from his harness to Robert's belt. "We walk together. Do not let go of the rope," Roland shouted over the howling wind. They stepped back into the void. The return journey was agonizing. Robert was sluggish, his body giving in to hypothermia. Roland practically dragged the heavier man through the final 100 yards, following the taut orange lifeline back to his shelter. When they finally tumbled through the airlock of the Iron Turtle, Robert collapsed onto the concrete floor, weeping. The ambient temperature of 65 degrees felt like an oven. Roland stripped the wet layers off the shivering man, wrapped him in thermal blankets, and sat him by the wood stove. For the next 5 hours, they sat in silence, listening to the storm. Robert, humbled and exhausted, stared at the curved steel ceiling he had once called a coffin. "I was wrong," Robert whispered hoarsely, clutching a mug of tea. My architect charged me $100,000 for those plans. He said it was a fortress. It snapped like a matchstick. Nature doesn't care about blueprints. Robert, it only cares about resistance. You have to deflect, not resist. Just as Roland said it, a sound unlike anything they had heard so far vibrated through the earth. It wasn't the high-pitched scream of the wind. It was a deep, guttural rumble. Roland's eyes went wide. Avalanche! The massive accumulation of snow on the peak above them had finally given way. The rumble turned into an earth-shattering roar. The ground beneath their feet violently shook. Then, the impact hit. The iron turtle shuddered violently. A deafening crunch echoed overhead. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness, save for the orange glow of the wood stove. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling. Robert screamed in panic. "It's caving in, Roland. The roof is caving in. Overhead, the screech of tearing metal was terrifying. The outer polycarbonate shell cracked loudly, and they could hear the heavy thud of thousands of tons of snow and ice pressing down on them. A sharp ping echoed through the room as one of the interior structural bolts sheared off, shooting across the room like a bullet and embedding itself in the wooden doorframe. "Stay down!" Roland yelled, tackling Robert to the floor beneath the heavy steel framing of the kitchen table. For 2 agonizing minutes, the shelter groaned. The steel plates shifted, shrieking as the immense weight of the avalanche buried them. It was exactly what Robert had predicted, the weight of the mountain coming down on the flat-topped dome. Then, silence. The violent shaking stopped. The wind was no longer audible. They were completely entombed. Robert was hyperventilating in the dark. "We're dead. We're buried alive. The roof failed." Roland clicked on a heavy-duty flashlight and shined it upward. The ceiling had dropped nearly 6 inches. The outer steel panels were warped and buckling under an unimaginable load. One of the main support struts was bent at a terrifying 30-degree angle, but the roof had not collapsed. Roland let out a slow, shaking breath, a tight smile forming on his lips. "The outer shell failed," he said, his voice echoing in the eerie, insulated silence of the buried room. But the geodesic core held. It did exactly what it was designed to do. "What are you talking about?" Robert gasped. "The roof isn't one solid piece. Robert, it's a suspension matrix. When the avalanche hit, the outer layer collapsed downward. But that downward force was redirected outward into the rammed earth walls. The harder the snow pushes down, the tighter the inner steel triangles lock together. The mountain just gave us an extra 10 feet of insulation." They spent the next 36 hours trapped underground. They had food, water, and heat from the stove, which vented through a reinforced steel pipe that Roland had strategically routed through the strongest part of the bunker. The psychological toll of being buried alive weighed heavily on Robert, but Roland kept him grounded, explaining the math and physics of why they were safe. On the afternoon of the 4th day, they heard a rhythmic thud. Thud. Thud echoing down the ventilation pipe. Roland banged a cast-iron skillet against the pipe in response. 2 hours later, a shaft of blinding white sunlight pierced the darkness as a county search and rescue team, led by Sheriff David O'Connor, breached the airlock door with shovels and chainsaws. "Roland," Sheriff O'Connor yelled, shining a flashlight into the dusty room. "You tough old bastard. We thought you were a goner for sure." Roland and Robert emerged from the earth like ghosts. Blinking against the harsh sunlight, they stood on top of 20 feet of packed avalanche debris. The landscape was unrecognizable. The trees were stripped bare or snapped in half. Robert looked up the ridge, where his majestic, multi-million-dollar A-frame had stood. There was absolutely nothing. Only a flat expanse of white powder. The wind and the avalanche had erased it from the map completely. He slowly turned to look at the crater in the snow from which they had just emerged. The topsoil was stripped away, exposing the heavily dented, warped, but unbroken steel dome of Roland's home. Sheriff O'Connor shook his head. Sterling's place is gone. Roland, total loss, if he hadn't been with you. The sheriff trailed off, looking at Robert. It's a miracle you boys made it. Robert stepped forward, placing a trembling hand on Roland's shoulder. He looked at the bruised and battered iron turtle, no longer seeing a scrap metal eyesore, but the most beautiful piece of architecture he had ever laid eyes on. It wasn't a miracle, David, Robert said softly, looking Roland in the eye. It was good engineering. Nature's fury tests our limits, but human ingenuity and resilience can weather the most impossible storms. Roland's story proves that sometimes the craziest ideas are the ones that save our lives. If this incredible tale of survival kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life stories. Stay safe out there.